Today we're continuing to talk about passive transport so we can understand the transport of chemicals across membranes, and what we're talking about today is osmosis. So we talked last time about how diffusion causes chemicals to move from areas of high concentration to areas of low concentration. Well, what if the cell membrane stops a chemical from moving? So salts, when you dissolve them in water, they break apart into their ions, and ions have charge. Charged particles cannot move across the cell membrane on their own. There are ways we can get them across, but if you just leave everything be, they won't be able to move down the concentration gradient. But the concentration gradient's still going to exist, so what's going to happen? Well, it turns out something called osmosis happens, and unfortunately does not work where you sleep on top of your textbook to learn everything. What osmosis is osmosis is the movement of water according to a concentration gradient. And what's interesting is that this kind of moves in the opposite direction that you'd expect. But really what's happening is it's the water moving, not the solute. So the same thing's going to happen in osmosis. We're going to balance out the concentrations on either side of the cell membrane, but we're going to do it by causing the water to move instead of moving the actual chemical that's dissolved in the water. So the way that this works is that in a cell, you might have the extracellular fluid, the stuff outside of the cell, be more or less concentrated than the cytoplasm inside the cell. So in this example, we have the outside of the cell is what we call hypotonic. Hypo means low. So the outside of the cell in this case is less concentrated than the inside of the cell. So the concentration gradient inside the cell is high and outside the cell is low. But what that means is that you have lots of water outside the cell and less water inside the cell, at least relative to the amount of chemicals that are inside there. So there's actually a second concentration gradient here. There's the concentration gradient of the chemical. We'll just assume it's salt for now. There's the concentration gradient of the salt, but then there's also the concentration gradient of the water. And the concentration gradient of the water is the opposite of the concentration gradient of the salt. Now, this is a bit unusual because we usually don't talk about concentration of water because it's the solvent. And in chemistry, we really don't talk about how concentrated the solvent is because the solvent is the thing doing the dissolving. And it is actually really difficult to measure the concentration of water for exactly that reason. But what we can look at, like this diagram has, is percentages. We can see in our diagram on the right here that inside the cell we have 80% water, and outside the cell we have 90% water. So what does that mean? Well, that means that the water is going to want to move into the cell. So when we say a solution is hypotonic, it means that it's less concentrated than the cell's cytoplasm on the inside. And in a hypotonic solution, water will move into the cell. We say that the solution is actually losing water, but the water is going into the cell. So it's getting absorbed by the cell, and the cell will have more pressure on the inside of it. We can also have the reverse happen. The solution could be hypertonic. Hyper means higher, so hypertonic means it has a higher concentration than the cytoplasm. Okay, so what happens here? Well, the concentration gradient is we've got high concentration outside and low concentration inside. But for the water, that means that there's lots of water inside and not a lot of water outside. So the water is going to exit out of the cell. And if this gets extreme enough, it can actually cause the cell to shrivel up and implode on itself. It can kill the cell entirely. This is why you don't want to put freshwater fish in salt water, because salt water is going to be hypertonic to them. It is going to cause them to lose all of their water, and they will literally dehydrate because of the salt. Also, the reason you don't want to drink salt water if you're dehydrated, because any amount of salt in the salt water pretty much overwhelms your kidneys and causes your extracellular fluid to go hypertonic on you. Same thing with putting saltwater fish into fresh water, just the other way around. The fresh water would be hypotonic and cause the fish to literally gain a whole bunch of water inside of them, which would actually make their cells explode and kill them. There are some species of fish that can switch between the two. They're actually able to adapt their cytoplasm to the tonicity of the water around them, but most of them can't, and that's exactly why it's lethal to them. What we want all the time is a state called isotonic, and this is where osmosis isn't taking place, right? Osmosis is the movement of water into or out of the cell. Well, in an isotonic solution, iso means same. They have the same concentrations. Now, that doesn't mean water's not moving in or out of the cell. It just means that it's going to do that at the same rate. Just as much water is going to move out as water comes in. And this is where our cells like to be. So our body actually works really hard to make sure that the fluid that surrounds our cells is a good environment for the cells themselves, because the cells will automatically move towards isotonicity, where they have the same concentration as the fluid around them, and that can actually determine a lot about whether those cells live or die. So maintaining that water balance is extremely important. Too much water and the cell will burst. Literally, not an exaggeration. Too little water and the cell shrivels. It can't send anything within itself and it will die. We call this bursting lysis, and in fact, that might sound familiar because you've heard of lysosomes before. Doesn't actually have anything to do with osmosis, but the way that lysosomes function is that lysosomes will rip open, they'll cause the cell membrane to burst, just like it would if there was too much water inside. Too little water, it shrivels up and dies. So this osmosis is really, really important. And especially you'll see in Biology 20 next year, plays a major role in maintaining your water balance within the kidneys.